Hey there! I am Chroma, and today I will be teaching you how to save and load data in Unity. We will be creating this system to be able to save and load a password, even when we close and reopen the game. Now, I'll be teaching you two methods of how you can save information in Unity. One that will be simple and quick and should work for any basic situations where you might need to save data, but then I'll be showing you a second, better, and in my opinion, superior way of how you can go about saving data in Unity that'll give you a lot more customizability, and there's just a lot more that you can do with it, as we'll be getting into. Now, that way will be a little bit more complicated in the programming department, but I'm going to do my best to explain things as thoroughly as possible. So without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so to get started, I've gone ahead and made this basic scene here that has our password and the buttons that you just saw, and they're already set up so that the incrementing and decreasing these numbers work, but all these buttons don't do anything. Well, actually, the reset password just sets that all to 0. But I've gone ahead and set this up so we can roll right into the actual saving and loading of the password, the thing you came here for. But I want to just quickly go and show how I set this up, because it's going to sort of have to do with how we're then dealing with these numbers. So up here, I have a canvas that has 4 text components that are these zeros here that you can see, and they're all their own numbers that we can move around, and then you could duplicate them if you wanted to make more, I suppose. Then as child objects of each of them, we have these 2 buttons here, the increase number button and the decrease number button. Then these are just buttons with, I took away the text component of it and replaced it with this arrow, and then just made it more of a square and green, just because. Now, as a child object of this then has the a second image that's the actual arrow itself. That was just taken from the default drop-down arrow image that exists. So that is how that is done. Then all of these are currently just calling a function on this saving and loading game object that's then increasing the number or decreasing the number. With it's passing as input what number it's going to be increasing or decreasing. So that these buttons will increase or decrease this number. These 2 buttons will increase or decrease these numbers. That's all there is to that. Then these buttons over here are, again, just basic buttons that if you watch my UI basics tutorial, you can see about how I went about making those. But yeah, currently they don't really do anything other than calling a blank function that we're going to get into writing in just a second. Other than the reset password, because that doesn't really have to do with the saving and loading. We'll be getting to that in just a moment. So then after that, we then have this saving and loading script that's taking as input these 4 number text objects. And now we're going to be jumping into the code to get all of that working. So here we are. I have a bunch of basic code written up to just do the increasing the number and the decreasing the number. And then we have a bunch of sort of blank spots here that in a moment we're going to be, well, actually right now, we're going to be filling in to actually save our passwords and load them and do all that fun stuff. Now, I just want to quickly show what how the increase number and decrease number stuff is working. So first of all, we have up here our password numbers that you just saw in the inspector. In order to get this text component, we have using UnityEngine.ui at the top. Then we have this function here called increase number that was being called by all the green arrows along the top, and then it takes as input a number for what number it is. So 0 is going to be the first one, then 1 is the second, and so on. Then what we're doing is getting the actual text of that number, because it comes as a text, or it comes as a string because it's a text component, so it can be a string, but we're just pretending that it's a number because of how we're using it. So we're taking that text, converting it into an integer with int.parse, adding 1 to it, and then that increments our number. Then we want to test if it's equal to 10 or if it's greater than 9, basically, so then we can set it to 0 so it sort of flips around, because that's just how we're using it there. Then we are setting to the text to the new number that we just calculated here. Then for decrease number, we do the exact opposite. We take away 1, and then if it's now -1 or less than 0, we're setting it to 9, and then setting the text to that new number. So that's all of that. Then this reset password function here is just going through all of the numbers that we have here, all these text components, and then just setting their text to 0. So it's just resetting all the numbers, and that's just printing reset, just so I could be sure that the function was running. Now, that is all of that. Now let's get into actually what you came here for, saving and loading data. So as I said, I'm going to be teaching you 2 ways of how we can go about saving data. I'm going to be quickly glancing over the first one because it's not the main one we're going to be using. I just wanted to show that it existed. And we're going to use our start function up here to show off that. So the first way of how we can go about saving and loading data in Unity is using a function called, if I can type it, PlayerPrefs. And if we hit dot, there's a bunch of options here, like get int, get string, has key, all this sort of stuff. I'm actually just going to comment that out for a second. Let's say, because I'm not going to be saving the passwords with this, let's say that you're making a platformer and you have a level select and you want to save the last unlocked level. That's what we're going to use as an example for the whole PlayerPrefs thing. So let's make a private, let's have it be an integer and call it unlocked level, because that makes sense as a name for the example I just described. And let's say by default it's 1, because you have the first level unlocked by default. Now in PlayerPrefs, let's say that we have some function that gets called after you beat a level, and let's say we want to set unlocked level to 5 as an example. You've now unlocked level 5 for whatever reason. So now we want to save this information so that when we close the game and reopen it, or we load our save file and all that, we then get this information so we know that the current unlocked level is 5. So we can use PlayerPrefs to do that. Now we can do that by using PlayerPrefs.get. Now we have 3 get functions here. We can use get float, get int, and get string, and this is kind of how we're, sorry, not get, set. Very similar, we're going to be using both. So we have set float, set int, and set string. Now for our purposes here, we're going to use get int because we're saving an integer, but the process will be the same for all 3 of those. So now we want to, actually if I leave the bracket like open here, we can see what we need here. We need a string key and an int value. So now we want to say, what do we want to actually call this value that we're saving, like as a string? And this can be whatever you want. We're going to call this unlocked level, as so we just kind of had with the variable there. And then we have a comma, and then the actual value that we're passing into this. So we're going to pass in our unlocked level variable that was currently 5 here, and then we can end the line there. So now this effectively does all that we needed to do. So we've just saved this integer, and that's all there is to that. That's all you need to know. So now if we want to later on, or when we start a new game, or not a new game, when we load our save file after opening the game or whenever, we want to get that value that we've saved, we can then go PlayerPrefs.get int, the other one that I was showing before, and then we can just type in that same string that we want to get. And then this will get us the unlocked level variable, or it'll guess that 5 variable that we just saved. But then we want to actually go and save that in a variable. So unlocked level equals this. And then that will be 5. As well, another thing you can do here is you can then pass another parameter as a default value. So in case this is the first time launching the game and save file does not exist, like you've never saved this before, it can be good to just put in a default value. So in this case, we could put 1 because we want let's say the default value of this to be 1 or 0 or whatever it is you'd want that to be. So in a nutshell, this would do everything you would need it to do if you're just saving like one value, or just doing something very simple in terms of what you're saving. As well, one additional thing with it is that if you wanted to then delete the save file, you could use setInt and just set it to 1, and that would effectively delete it. But another thing you could do is go PlayerPrefs.delete. You can either delete a specific key, so deleting just the unlocked level variable, or go delete all to delete everything. So that is the first and simple basic way of how we can delete and save data. And I didn't really make an example with this because I'm going to be using the other one to show off the whole password system. So yeah, now this isn't what we're going to be mainly using. As I just said, we're going to be covering a different way that's going to involve actually saving data in a file, and we'll be able to do more with it. Because one limitation of this PlayerPrefs system is that, as you saw with setInt, there's only 3 different types of variables we can set. We can only set floats, ints, and strings. With the way I'm going to be showing you, you can store a lot more. Or more specifically, you could store like arrays of stuff. And you can store multiple different things very easily without having to have different strings for all of the different things that you're saving. And it'll be more robust and more easily customizable as you get into like more complex code. So let's get into that. So I'm just going to remove all of this code here with this unlock level example. Now let's get into actually what we're doing with these password numbers. So to start off, we are basically going to be going up here, and we're going to be making another class. Now, up here, we have public class saving and loading mono behavior. This is, if you're new to coding, you know that like this whole thing is basically all of what you have your code in, and this name will match this file name, and that's just all the code that runs in a file. Now, or in a script file here. With relations to Unity. Now you can actually have multiple classes in one script, and it's only the one that has the name that is shared with the actual file name that will run like the start function and the update function with the way that you have that set up. But you can't have other classes, and that's what we're going to be utilizing here. So we're going to go public class, and we can call this whatever we want. I'm going to call it save data because we're basically going to make another class that's going to store our save data. Fair enough. Like, that's basically what the name is. It describes what it's doing. So now in this class, we can make a bunch of variables, and we're basically going to then be saving this class in a file, if that makes sense. Like in a text file, like a basically text document that you can open up in a notepad or whatever, something similar to that. There's a bit more to it, but we'll be getting to that when we get there. So what we want to be storing in here is the 4 numbers that correspond to the actual digits of the password. Now, I suppose you could just store one int that is the whole password, but in this case, because we're treating all 4 number slots as different things, we're going to just store it as an array of 4 numbers. So what we're going to do here is go public int with square brackets to show that it's an array, and we're just going to call it password. Easy enough. So now, one other thing that we have to do to make this work the way that we want it to is in front of the class, the line before we make it, we have to type system.serializable. Now, what this is going to do is basically make it, even though it's a public class because we define it that way, this will make it hard to explain, but kind of more public. So we can do more with it, so we can actually save it in a file and get that information from a file, and so that we can serialize it, which we'll get into what that is when we're actually saving stuff in the file. I'm trying to go through this very thoroughly because I know people maybe watching this video might not be the most, might be new programmers and all of that. There's some people watching this that might know all this, and I might be boring you, and I apologize, but I just want to have this be as thoroughly explained as possible. But anyway, so this will then be a class that we're going to be saving in a text file. And now we can also just make more variables if we want to, and all of them are eventually going to be saved in this text file. So now that we have that, let's get into the actual text file part of things. So in order to do that, up at the top, we're going to need to add another namespace. Now what that means is, so up here, we have these 3 that should exist by default when you open up a new C# script in Unity. We have system.collections, system.collections.generic, and using Unity Engine. Now, when I use UI stuff, for example, you might be familiar with this. We use using Unity Engine.ui, and if we were to want to switch between scenes, there's using Unity Engine.scene management and stuff like that. We're basically going to need to add more of those to do the file stuff that we want to do. So I guess in between here, it doesn't really matter the order that you type them, but we're going to type using system.io. That stands for input output, and that's going to have to do with how we get input from files and output stuff to files. Simple enough. Then we need a second one called using system, and this is going to be a long one, brace yourselves, system.runtime.serialization.formatters.binary. That's a long one, but basically what this is going to do is allow us to not just save that information in a file, but allow us to sort of encode it so that even if the person using or playing your game or whatever knows exactly where this file is stored on their computer, it should be, and hopefully, it'll basically be encoded in a way that'll be harder to read and be able to have people just open up your saved data in a notepad document, just change this unlocked levels variable from 5 to 10, and then now have all the levels unlocked in your game or whatever, which may or may not matter to you, but I'm just showing you this way because it exists and it might be useful to you. So anyways, now that we have these 2 namespaces here, and they're currently gray because we're not using them anywhere in our code, but as we actually do stuff with them, they're going to become not gray, basically. So next thing that we need, so we have our password numbers here, we need more variables. First thing we're going to need is the actual name of the file, like what we're going to be calling the file that we're storing. So that's going to be a string, and we're going to make it public just so we can change it in the inspector if we so wanted to. And this can be whatever we want it to be. Let's call it save data. It doesn't have to match the name of this class up here, but I'm just calling it save data. And then we can make it a .txt file if you want it to be like you can actually make this whatever you want, which is kind of interesting. So you can have your own unique file extension for your save data. But if you made it like a .txt, then you could hypothetically open it up in like a notepad document or whatever. Not that that really matters. But yeah, now there are probably some restrictions in terms of like what you can just name a file, so you can't have certain special characters and all that. And it can't like start with a number, I think. But for the most part, just you can name it anything that you could name a normal file. So now with that, next thing we need is the actual, not just the file name, but where we're going to be storing it on the computer. Now, for now, we're going to make a, not that, we're going to be making a private, a string, and we're just going to call it path, and we're going to be defining it in start, which is going to be like the actual, where we're storing it on the computer. The next thing that we're going to need is what's called a binary formatter. That's going to have to do with this stuff of how we're actually then formatting the information to then be stored in the text document. So we're going to need to make a private binary formatter, and we're going to call it formatter. Just because, again, the names of these variables are arbitrary. You can name them whatever you want. So next we're going to initialize this. We can just go equals new binary formatter and then brackets here. This is just what we have to do to set up the formatter so that we can use it. And this is the same type of thing as if you were to make like a text thing here in Unity, and then you can go equals new text, except this is an array, so you'd have like square brackets. You can define the length to be like 4 or 5 or whatever. So it's the same similar kind of thing. Anyways, so now in start, what we're going to want to do is set up that path that I made here. So we're just going to set it up, yeah, in start. So what that's going to be equal to is path equals. Now, you could hypothetically make, oh, why is all this? Oh, just because I'm taking this line. Okay. Right. Password numbers. Oh, I got rid of the S here. Okay, fair enough. So now this path, you could hypothetically make it whatever you want. But if you're working with different systems, potentially having like Windows and Macs and phones and tablets all running your game, having to know what path you're using for all the different devices could be a bit tricky. Luckily, Unity has a helpful function for us to help us out with that by just going application, if I can type it right, application.persistent data path. And now, actually, if I hover my mouse over this, what should say that contains the path to a persistent data directory. So as it says, it's going to go to a consistent place every time, depending on what machine that you're running this on. So Windows, Macs, phones, whatever, it's going to go to a place that it will be consistent. So after that, we then want to add our file name. So basically, wherever this is going, in that place, then the path going to our file name, so that's actually storing in the file that we're wanting to name, like as this file name up here. Now, if you're curious as to what the persistent data path is for whatever device you're planning on making a game for, you can go to the Unity documentation and look this up. If you just copy and paste this into Google, you should be able to find in like 2 seconds where specifically this might be going to your for your particular needs. But anyways, let's continue. So now that we have all of that set up, now we can get to the actual saving passwords, and we'll go. Actually, I'm going to copy and paste this to the bottom because we're going to do it last. We're going to do the saving and loading stuff first, just because this is probably the main things that you came for, and this will kind of have to do with what we do down here. Anyways, so now with actually saving passwords, the first thing that we want to do is actually make the file that we're going to be saving our data in. So to do that, we're going to type file stream, and we can call this file, I suppose. This is going to be the file that we're saving our stuff in. And then we go new, file stream, and then we're basically making this stream. A bit hard to explain, but yeah, we're basically then, long story short, this is just the file that we're making the file that we're going to then be storing our data into. So we have to pass in the actual path of this file, which is going to be the path that we made up above. And then we have a few different file modes that we can choose from. Oh, not that. File mode. We have to set a file mode, and there's a few different ones that we have available to us. The main things that we're going to be using are create and open. So we can create a file mode.create. This will create a file at this path location that we set. Or if a file already exists, then we can use open. And hint, hint, that's what we're going to be doing for loading our files. So now we have that. Next, we need to actually make the save data and set it up to actually then be put into the file. So to do that, we're going to make a variable of type save data. So this is using, oh, actually we can call it whatever. I can call it just data, I guess. And equals new save data, similar to actually exactly what we just did for the file stream thing. So this is going to, our class up here, it's going to make a variable that is the type of that class. So if you're not sure what that means, it's basically we are making a variable in a similar way that we would with a string or an int or all that stuff, but the type is save data, and this will give us access to like this password variable here. It's the exact same as how we make like a text object here, or we can get a reference to a game object, transform, rigid body, binary formatter, all that. It's the same type of system. So now that we have that, we can then go data.password, and then this is the password thing up here, or whatever other variables we make in the save data function or class. Now, actually, the one thing, now that it's on my mind, I should quickly say, is that we can't make functions in here, or actually, I'm not sure what would happen if we did, but this is meant to just have variables, and that's it. In fact, there's certain type of variables that we can't have. I'll get to that when we get into the loading. But yeah, basically, we can then just get reference to this password variable and then actually set it to whatever we want. In this case, we're going to be actually then getting all of our numbers that we have over in Unity, not there, over here. These numbers that we have here, we're going to be getting reference to what they currently are at this point in time, because that's the information that we care about saving. So data.password, we're going to be setting it to, currently it's nothing. We have to actually define the array first. This is going a little bit away from the actual saving data part, because we just want to actually get that information from the password numbers. But I'm going to show you how I'd go about doing it because it's going to be decently important, and this is going to show you a basic structure of how you might go about getting information from an array to store in another array that's in the save data thing. So I would say that's going to be useful. Anyways, so what we're going to do is make this password. We're going to be setting it to new int, and then you pass in the length of this integer array that you want. So we could set it to 4 because we know in the inspector that we only have 4 numbers, but allowing it to just be more customizable so you can have different lengths, we can just pass in password numbers.length, which is this array here. So whatever that length is, this will be the same. So if we had 5, if we add more text things to have a longer password or a shorter password, then that will update more easily than if we just put in a fixed number that we'd then have to change. So now we want to go through and get all of these password numbers and set all of them to these password numbers, if that makes sense. So we're going to use a for loop to do that by just going for int I equals 0, I is less than password numbers dot length, and then I plus plus. So this will then just go through all of those password numbers, and we could have password numbers dot length or data.password.length. It should be the same number, so it doesn't really matter which one you use. Again, we could also use 4, but then we'd have to worry about changing the numbers if we change those lengths. So then, to actually put the information from the one into the other, we can go data.passwords I equals new, or sorry, not that, equals, so then we want to actually get the text from that password number that we're currently on. So we can go password numbers I dot text, except, like I said before, this is a string, and we're passing it into an integer, so what we're going to want to do is go int.parse, and then brackets around all of that. That'll just convert it into an integer like we want it, because we're treating this text as if it was just a number, because it is for the ways that we're using it. So then, now we have all of this data in the data class variable that we made, so now we want to actually save it in the file. So how we're going to go about doing that is using wherever it was, this thing, the binary formatter that we made. So we're going to, in order to use that, go formatter, the name of the variable that we had up here, dot serialize, and this is a function that takes a, whoop, I just had it there. Nope, come on. Okay, so that takes a serialization stream and then a object graph. We'll get to that in a second. So the string that we're passing in is the actual file that we have here. So we're passing in the file that we want to put this data in, and then we can pass in basically what we're going to be passing in is just data, the actual object. It's technically, you could call it an object, but this class, this variable that we made, we're going to be passing that in. So formatter.serialize the file, then the data that we're putting in. Now, one thing that's important is having the system.serializable attribute up here. Otherwise, it won't give you errors here, but when you go to actually run it and save stuff, then you'll get errors there. So I had to find out that the hard way when I was first setting this up. But now that we have this all stored in the file, we have the data in the file, it's saved somewhere on your computer or phone or whatever. Now, lastly, we just need to close the file. And that is important because otherwise, it's just important to close files that you open because otherwise you can just get funky things to happen. I haven't seen that much in Unity, but I know it can happen in other programming languages. This can cause weird results, especially when you go to then print things, just having not good stuff happen. It's just better to always close the files that you open. Just make sure that's a thing that you do. And if you're having funky stuff happen, then that might be why. Now, this will allow us to save. Now, in order to then test whether that saving is working, let's get the loading up and running. So this I can go through a bit faster because it's going to be doing a lot of what we've been doing here just in reverse. So this video is going on for a long time, but it's necessary, and now things will start to speed up. So for loading password, although we do want to just get the password and get the data, one thing we want to be careful of is whether or not this file actually exists. Because if we are just starting the game for the first time, the file may have never been created and may not exist. So if we try to open a file that doesn't exist, there can be problems there. So what we're going to want to do first is if we just go if file.exists, and that's a function that we can use with the system.io stuff up here. So if file.exists, and we put in the path, basically if the file exists, we can do something. We can load the file, or we can do whatever we need to do if the file doesn't exist, so whatever new game functions we want. So we'll get to this in a second. Yeah, whatever. Let's just deal with the case where the file does exist so that we can load it. So the first thing we're going to do is exactly what we did up here, where we want to just get the file. And we can actually just copy and paste the code down here, because it's going to be very similar. So again, we're getting a file stream file, new file stream, path, except this time we're going to use filemode.open. Now, you could also use filemode.open or create, I suppose, but we're just going to stick with filemode.open for our purposes here. Next, we want to then actually get the data from that file. So this save data stuff that we set up. So again, the exact reverse of what we did just a few moments ago. So we can call this data as well. Again, this name doesn't matter. This name just needs to match the class because that's the whole reason why we created it. Now, this equals basically, so we have this formatter.serialize function here. We're going to do kind of the opposite of that by going formatter.deserialize, which will do the opposite. So this, then we can just pass in the file, and we only need to pass in one thing, and then that will return, it'll deserialize the data that we want. Now you'll notice everything's flashing red, and it says that it can't implicitly convert the object to save data. We have to do it for it. So how we can do that, and just telling it that the data that it's getting is of type save data, is just by putting in brackets the word save data, and then just putting that in front of there. And that will convert it to being of type save data so that it actually gets stored here like we want it to without errors. So now that we have basically this class being saved, now we just need to get the password from it, which depending on what data you're saving, this is where you actually just take all the information out, the exact opposite of what we did here, and then you can do whatever you need to do with it with your game, like a shop system or a unlock level system. This is then where you do all of that. So for our purposes, we're going to need to set the password to whatever we need to save it to. So in order to do that, we are going to just copy and paste this down here and then do basically the opposite here. So we're going to go through the password numbers again, like we did up above, except this time, instead of setting the password text to the data.password, we need to do the flipped reverse version of this. So I'm going to type it right beside it and then delete that other line. So basically then what we need to do is go password numbers I dot text equals data dot password I, and now this is an int that we want to turn into a string, so we can just go dot to string. And this is again the inverse of doing this, where we had int dot parse and all this stuff. So this will get the data and convert it into a string for it to be passed to our text. Perfect. Now one last thing to do is just go file.close. Like that. because again, it's important to close any files that you open. So now we want to handle the other case, the last little thing that we're doing here. Well, we can also delete data, but that will take like 2 seconds. So the last main thing that we're doing here is covering the case where the file doesn't exist. So when the file doesn't exist, we basically want to sort of set up like a new game data type thing. Now you could make a new function called like new game and then set stuff up in there, call it through here, but I can just type it in here because it's only going to be a few lines. Now, what happens exactly in the case where we want to start a new game? Well, we're basically going to be setting this password text like we were before, but we're just going to set it to its default values, whatever we would want the default save to look like. Or at least that's what we're doing here. You can do that however you want. So we can copy and paste this code down here, except instead of setting the text to a data that we don't have because it doesn't exist, we're just going to set it to 0. Now, a 0 in strings because, again, it's meant to be a string for text. Now, apparently, I actually only discovered this recently, you could type the number 0 and go .toString. That exists, although it's weird. I literally did not know that was a thing until making this tutorials, but I guess you could do that, but I'm just going to stick with this because it looks better. Yeah, so then with that, one last thing we can do, just to make sure that a file does get created with these default values, we can then call our save, not save data, but our save password function. Then this will basically go up here and then save the password with these default values, if this is how you want to have it set up. So perfect, and now we have saving and loading. Now one last little thing I want to cover in case, like, because it's important probably, if you want to then delete data, what we can do is just go file.delete path, and this will then go and delete the file that we made. Now another thing you could do is actually exactly what we did here, is you could just put in the default information and then just save that, basically overwrite that default information. That would also do effectively the same thing as deleting, or you can just delete the actual file outright, so then it won't exist anymore, basically. So either or, whichever you prefer. And another thing we can do to be, I guess, more certain that we're deleting everything and sort of resetting everything to whatever extent you want to, is we can then save passwords. We can save this default information. Actually, this wouldn't do that. Now that I think about it, it would save whatever, whatever data is currently in the password field. So I guess what we could also do is go reset password, so then it would all go to zeros, and then it would save that password of all zeros. If you wanted to fully reset everything, you could delete the data while still keeping the password wherever it was. But again, this is just dependent on whatever you're actually using all this saving and loading for. But yeah, now we should have a saving and loading system working. Now, one little thing here is that technically all this increased number, decreased number stuff could be in its own script. It doesn't really have to do with the saving and loading. And yeah, you could do that. It would probably be better. But for the sake of this tutorial, I just wanted to keep everything in one code file just so it was cleaner to look at. And you could see all the code all at once as it was forming. So now we can head back to Unity. We haven't seen this in ages. And then go, and everything should be set up now. So we have the actual file name here of what we want to call the file, the numbers as we have them before. All of the buttons, like our increase and decrease buttons, are all set up to the code that we made, and our save and load buttons. If you're curious on how this was set up, I can just quickly explain, is that after making a button, and by default it should look like this, you can just drag the object that has that code on it that you want to call. Actually, you have to hit plus first. Drag this into here, and then you can, clicking this no function button, click the saving and loading, the name of that script, and then you can find whatever password or whatever function that you want. So the save password function that you made. Now, with that set up, we can then go into Unity and test this out. So now, like before, we can make these passwords whatever we want. We can hit save password, and you can see in the console, we are saving the password. And actually, I can make this full screen because why not? It'll look nicer. So yeah, now as you can see, when we hit the save button, this save function runs. Now you could do more pizzazz stuff to make it show that things are saving, but we don't really need to do that here. So after saving the password, we can then reset the password to all zeros, and if we hit load, then ta-da, our password exists. Now, even more so, if we go out of play mode and then back into play mode and hit load password again, whatcha, it comes back, despite us resetting the game. The whole point of why we're doing this. So the same thing will also be true if you were to actually build this into his own application and then close the game and then reopen it. Everything should save, and then now you can delete the data. Everything will go back to the zeros. If you try to load password, oh, it doesn't exist. You can save a password of all zeros. You can press the numbers, save it, and yeah, do all of that. So now we have a saving and loading system up and running. So that's pretty cool. This can be a very powerful thing for your games. Most games have saving and loading of some kind, even though it can be a bit of a complex thing to get working, especially with all that binary formatter stuff. So I hope I was able to explain things well enough that it was able to be understood. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. Actually, my videos have been getting more comments recently on my tutorials, and I really appreciate that. I like helping out all of you who might have questions about your games. I'm no expert, but I'll try my best. But now I have a challenge for you all. So now that we have this saving and loading system set up, I challenge you to, whatever game you're working on, whenever you're watching this tutorial, to get your saving and loading system working in your game and try saving something beyond what was just done in this tutorial. So maybe saving, I don't know, a bunch of strings or a bunch of floats or something like that. Or maybe you have like a level select and actually saving the unlock level, or a shop system where you want to save all of the things that have been bought from the shop, or saving a currency, saving that amount. Actually, with a shop, you could probably have an array of booleans in order to be able to save like a true or false thing for all of the items that have been bought or stuff like that. Now, actually, now that I've said that, I do want to just give one little disclaimer thing. I'm just going to go back into our code real quick. So I meant to cover this. I almost forgot to, but thankfully I remembered. So up here, I was saying that you could make variables of a bunch of different types. Now, one thing that you can't do is you couldn't make an array of game objects or transforms or rigid bodies, stuff like that. You can't really save those in files in the same way that you can save these basic data types. And the basically way that you can tell with that is the ones that are blue are the one, well, depending on your color scheme, whatever you're coding in, like Visual Studio or whatever. The blue ones, the basic variable types that you can use in most other, anything not Unity related, you can save those. Everything that's like Unity specific, pretty much, so all the transforms and game objects and all that, you can't really save those in this class and have them be serialized and turned into files. However, for any of those cases, there should be workarounds for them. So if you are saving like transforms, what are you really saving? You're probably saving like the positions and the rotations or maybe the scales. So then you could save those in arrays of integers and floats and all that. And then when you're loading this data, you can just pass those things into those transforms. And game objects, I don't really know what cases you'd be saving game objects, that you couldn't just turn them into prefabs and instantiate them or things like that. Although if you are making a very complex like level making system, that might be a bit more beyond the scope of this tutorial. But I still feel like all that stuff could be, in one way or another, converted into saving, again, like a bunch of positions and rotations and all that. Now, one small thing though with that is vector 3s or vector 2s or vector 4s or quaternions and all that. Those also can't be saved, but they can, because a vector 3 is just 3 integer values, right? So you could just have if you're trying to save a position, you can just save an int array or a float array of size 3, and that should suit all of your needs of being able to store all that information. Or a quaternion would just be an int or a float array of size 4. Same thing with colors and all that fun stuff. So while there are some things that you can't save, you kind of can if you're just clever enough about it to turn it into like ints, floats, booleans, all that. But being able to have like arrays of different lengths and all that, and being able to just have a bunch of different variables in this same class and not really have to change anything with all that formatter stuff, just changing like what you're actually putting in here when it comes time to actually save and load all your information, is a really powerful tool in Unity, because again, as I said before, most games have some way of having to save or load some kind of data, so it's important to, or it's useful to know how to do it, basically. But anyways, I guess that ends thing off here. So as I said before, I challenge you to apply all this to whatever game you're working on. But that'll do it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. And as always, I'll see you